Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Cantor Arts Center and the Anderson Collections Art Break with Student Guides. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before I introduce myself, I want to acknowledge that the two museums in Stanford University sit on the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma-Ohlone tribe. It is important that we honor the traditional stewards of this land and recognize the ongoing process of colonialism. I also want to take this opportunity to encourage you to submit any questions and comments that you have through the chat function throughout the event. I look forward to reading and to addressing them. I am Ekalan Hou, a senior studying art history, English literature, and comparative studies in race and ethnicity at Stanford. And today I will be speaking to the ways artists have coped with and stolen away from the burdens of visibility. While the very name of visual arts emphasizes visibility and seeing, the artists who I discuss today have chosen opacity to reflect a violent to deflect the violent surveilling eye, or in the words, of Maurice Wallace, the picture-taking racial gaze that fixes and frames subjects of color within a rigid and limited grid of representational possibilities. The first work that I hope to speak about is Titus Kaphar's painting, page 4 of Jefferson's Farm Book, January 1774, Goliath, Hercules, Jupiter, Jill, Fanny, Ned, Sucky, Frankie, Gil, Nell, Bella, Charles, Jenny, Betty, June, Toby, Duna, Kate, Hannah, Rachel, George, Ursula, George, Bagwell, Archie, Frank, Bet, Scylla. The title references the lists of enslaved people in Thomas Jefferson's Farm Book, which relegated humans to stockholdings to be kept tab of and to be returned to Jefferson if they were to run away or if they were stolen. Performing what he calls visual reparation, Kaphar, in a series of portraits, visualizes those enslaved by Jefferson as sitters in old master paintings. He uses tar to conceal and to represent those for whom there is no visual depiction or historical record. The medium of tar is suffused with symbolism, as Toni Morrison writes of her novel Tar Baby. I use that old story, meaning the Uncle Remus tale, because despite its funny, happy ending, it used to frighten me. The story has a tar baby in it, which is used by a white man to catch a rabbit. Tar baby is also a name that white people call Black children, Black girls, as I recall. Tar seemed to me to be an odd thing to be in a Western story, and I found that there is a tar lady in African mythology. I started thinking about tar. At one time, a tar pit was a holy place, at least an important place, because tar was used to build things. It came naturally out of the earth. It held things together like Moses' little boat and the pyramids. For me, the tar baby came to mean the Black woman who can hold things together. The story was a point of departure to history and prophecy. That's what I mean by dusting off the myth, looking closely at it to see what it might conceal. Morrison twists a contemptuous term for a Black person in a racist story into a force of binding and of solidarity, a practice that may be said of Kaphar's depiction of the ocean, that carrier of the traumatic histories of the Atlantic crossing. Before I offer an interpretation of this serene, if not hopeful background, I want to first rely on the words of the French theorist Edward Glissant.
C'est Christophe Colomb qui était parti dans ce qu'on appelait le Nouveau Monde, et c'est moi qui suis revenu. Et d'être sur ce bateau, ce n'est pas une revanche, ce serait stupide, ce serait la chose la plus énorme qu'on puisse dire, mais c'est amusant de savoir que mes ancêtres sont allés dans le Nouveau Monde dans de terribles conditions qui n'étaient pas celles-ci. diaspora, c'est un passage de l'unité à la multiplicité. C'est ce qui est important dans tous les mouvements du monde.
Echoing Glissant, Kaphar's depiction of a peaceful ocean foiling the black sitter cannot be explained away by something as simple as vengeance or as reversal. Kaphar asks what collectivity may take place against the history of a forced diaspora. The tar, which according to Morrison holds things together, becomes a shield and a pocket of hiding that enslaved men and women may secrete into. Goliath, Hercules, Jupiter, Jill, Fanny, Ned, Saki, etc. perform diasporic homemaking away from the surveilling eye, their intimacy unregistered and unintelligible to Jefferson's farm book. While Kaphar protects his sitters from a gaze that is always trying to reify and commodify them through the use of tar, Filipino-American artist Stephanie Syjuco confronts the violence of ethnographic photography in After Images, Interference of Vision, a work recently acquired by the Cantor Arts Center through the Asian American Art Initiative, directed by Dr. Elisa Alexander and Dr. Marcy Kwan. In Syjuco's series After Images, variously subtitled Interference of Vision, Deflection of Vision, Field of Vision, Interruption of Vision, and Obstruction of Vision, she photographs photos of Filipinos and the Philippine Reservation from the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, prints them as photogravures on Gampi paper, crumples them, and mounts them on Somerset Black 280-gram cotton rags. Working with Maloney Printing to produce and disfigure her photogravures, undoing a laborious and expensive process, Syjuco refutes and ironizes the United States' fabrication of the Philippines, then a recent colony, as the primitive past that foils American progress. The Gampi paper that betokens American sophistication is made out of bast fiber sourced from the Philippines. The original photogravures used to justify the US civilizing mission are born from a culture that the US relegated as barbarous and gawked at the human Zeus in the World's Fair. Syjuco strategically folds the photogravures to protect the sitters' faces from unsolicited attention and to intercept the proliferation of trauma. Recalling Audre Lorde's poem by the same name, Syjuco's After Images forestall ethnographic images' multiplication and entrance into the viewer's eyes and the enduring damages that they etch. If Susan Sontag has called a camera a sublimation of a gun, the clicking of the shutter like the pulling of a trigger, then Syjuco tries to return and to expel the injury from the camera's initial firing against Filipino people in her photographic manipulations. In addition to Kaphar and Syjuco's works, I hope to share a little about my thesis work in art history, also on the topic of visibility and invisibility. I am writing about Chinese diasporic photography in the late 19th and early 20th century, and one of my chapters focuses on the photography of Mary Tape, who is better known for her daughter Mamie Tape's Supreme Court case, Tape versus Hurley, that argued for Chinese American children's right to education in California. Mamie is a dignified child standing in the middle of the family portrait on the left, gingerly holding her brother Frank's hand. Mary is the woman on the right. Like Syjuco, Mary Tape needed to contend with the ethnographic eye, which was contemporaneous with her work and which threatened to turn her family into specimens. As the photographs at the top of the slide show, Mary Tape's grandchildren and Mamie Tape's daughter, Emily, and her son Harold were displayed at the Chinese Village in ethnic clothing, also at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. How did Tape square with the imperializing eye that was turning her and her family into objects of study? I discuss in my thesis the photographic strategies that Tape used to conceal and to protect her co-ethnic sitters. In this photograph of Cascade Cottage, for instance, Tape camouflages her children Frank, Emily, and Gertrude in nature. They become difficult to notice at first glance. The immediate focus of the photograph is the erect flagpole at its center, echoed by the vertical composition and the trees that reach skyward. The image is a reflection of the national ego par excellence. The United States brings order and provides anchorage to wilderness while inheriting its majesty. Supplementing the immaculate uprightness of the flag is its excessive multiplication. The patriotic reminder appears at the entrance of the cottage and replicates itself at every column. The human subjects are easily overlooked in the photograph and hide in its patriotic proclamations. Gertrude leans against the gate, her body is covered by the fence and her head blends into the lights and shadows of the thicket behind her. Frank is a chameleon on the staircase. His dark suits allow him to fuse with the steps, while his hat catches the lightness of the handrail. Emily peeks from behind the flagpole and mimics it with her white columnar dress. They are naturalized within the landscape in their various disguises and take refuge in an image of nationalism that they are deemed too foreign to take part in. Kate took up the camera, the instrument of Chinese people's objectification, in order not to be seen. She hid from while dwelling within the institution of her dispossession. I hope this presentation on the perils of visibility and the tactics that the artists have used to evade recognizability under a hostile gaze have been interesting to you. Furtiveness has been so central to people of color's survival, and these painters and photographers from the 19th century to the present are visionaries whose creations are, in the words of Frantz Fanon, directed by the secret hope of discovering beyond the misery of today, beyond self-contempt, resignation, and abjuration. Some very beautiful and splendid era whose existence rehabilitates us both in regard to ourselves and in regard to others. They are always picturing our futures. Thank you so much for tuning in, and now I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Please feel free to enter them through the chat feature. Thank you. Thank you, Sophia. Amy asks, can you tell us more about the other chapters in my thesis? And that is fascinating. Well, thank you. Some other chapters that I'm writing about include a chapter on Lai Yong, who is the first documented Chinese portrait painter and studio photographer in San Francisco. I may also talk about the studio photography of Feng Get, although the thesis may grow way too long, but at the moment, Lai Yong is already a fantastic subject of study because he had co-authored this article called The Chinese Question from a Chinese Standpoint in response to Chinese exclusion. And when that was not received the way he would like to and Chinese exclusion persisted, he actually moved back to Guangzhou to open a photo studio where he photographed Chinese people in Victorian costumes. So I'm really interested in his sartorial performances and also just his embrace of his diasporic subjectivity. And another interesting problem that comes with that is the imperialism that seems to follow him everywhere, right? Not only was he excluded in San Francisco, but even when he went back to China, his photo studio would actually be eventually burned down during the Sino-Japanese War. So, he is haunted by this imperialist force, despite his attempts to structure his identity in various countries. Another chapter in my thesis is on Frank Ju, who I actually found through Mary Tape's family albums. Frank Ju was great family friends with with Mamie Tape's son, Harold. And when Mamie moved to Portland, Frank was spending a lot of time photographing Mamie's family, actually. And he has some incredible photographs of just, Chinese joy during a time of exclusion, which I think is just wonderful and subverts a lot of other, family albums that we see at the time where, of course, we do see white families going on outings and, taking pictures of their travels, but we don't see Chinese subjects doing the same with policies like the Geary Act, et cetera, that basically would prohibit them from moving around without, certificates that prove their citizenship, which basically illegalize their, their personhood in nature. So these are some ideas that I'm working through, but thank you for asking that question. And Kate asks if I've thought about the landscape elements of Kaphar's painting, the sunset, the ocean. Yes, that's actually what I tried to briefly mention with the Glisson video, because of course, almost all of the paintings in this series has the ocean as the background. And I think something that I wanted to bring into this talk, although perhaps it's too complicated an idea to flesh out in a few minutes, but is that I think Kaphar is dealing with something that is more complicated than a revenge, right? To use the words of Glisson, of the Atlantic crossing. I think rather than just a statement on, these enslaved people's forced capture and, the absolutely horrendous and traumatic transportation that led them here, I think there is something else that Kaphar is trying to work through, that it's not as simple as a twist or a subversion so much as perhaps that with the binding force of the tar and, the ability that, for instance, artists like Toni Morrison or Kaphar is able to find intimacy within these, traumatic histories, and an intimacy that requires a hiding. I was trying to think through these ideas in relation to that transatlantic history. And basically, or to use Glisson's words again, how there was a unity found, right, in this multiplicity, or in this, I suppose, diasporic motion, how in this process of dispersion, still hope making was happening, even if furtively. Let's see, Maggie asks, what kind of photographs is Mary Tape known for, like portraiture, landscapes, architecture? Well, Mary Tape, I think she was mostly known because she was Chinese in a way. A lot of newspaper articles, focus on her as an Americanized Chinese lady. She was a member of the California Camera Club, and one of the articles in the club journal did mention that she was an expert she was an expert at handling lantern slides and at creating lantern slides, which lantern slides are these glass plates that almost work as, I suppose, projectors do, where if you use a lantern slide machine, it would project a large blown up image of the photograph on the wall, and you may cycle through different photographs, almost like, an early way of cinema, I suppose. And she was quite expert at handling those, although none of her glass plates survive. Like, I've only been able to work with prints of her photographs. But if people are interested, I know that Stanford Special Collections has an incredible collection of lantern slides, many of which are actually of Waters's early depictions of Chinatown that were really used, that were used to give people a first commercial taste of Chinatown. And a lot of them were used to justify Chinese people's vices, because there were these glass slides of opium dens, etc. So if you do have access to Stanford libraries, I would recommend looking at those. But Mary Tape photographed her family a lot, but of course she is always using different strategies of camouflage, hiding, etc. And she also did photograph some landscapes, but I think even in her photography of landscapes, there's something interesting, right? Because the California Camera Club was helping with the United States' imperializing mission, right? With Western expansionism, the camera was opening up the country and was, participating in that project. So while the California Camera Club was really keen to photograph sites like Yosemite, etc., to prove like the majesty of the California landscape, I think Mary Tape is, while being in that club, is trying to do something that's also outside of it. And I would say, for instance, you may look to the photograph of Cascade College. Of course, she has many more photographs as a landscape, but in which, people are hiding in nature. They're, secretly being naturalized in the landscape. So I think although there are genres that she is working in, she is also at the same time always trying to, find the dehiscence within them, right? Yes, thank you. I'm excited thank you all for the comments about the thesis. I would be more than happy to share it when it's done. And yes, Kate mentioned something in the chat about ocean as a passage, a means of transformation, a place where new relationships are formed and form. Yes, precisely. That is the connection that I was trying to make with the Glissant video. And yes, lantern slides were used in teaching art history before the advent of the 35mm slides. And of course, before the advent of digital images. Yes, for sure. So, and they were, of course, used also as these, evidence of successful imperializing missions, right? People would travel the world, quote unquote, and produce these lantern slides that would allow you to also travel, and see, for instance, Asian or African countries without, necessarily leaving Europe or America. And of course, that is really part of the whole thing of capturing the world and objectifying it, right, within this tiny picture. And Don mentions that it was shocking when I mentioned that the camera could be a subliminal type of gun. It's so true that we are used to viewing people's images without even a moment of respect that is deserved. Yes, thank you, Don, for that comment. Yes, Susan Sontag definitely made a really apt comment. And of course, if we think about, capturing a picture of someone, shooting a picture, these are all very violent, languages and words to use. And I think, especially thinking about the proliferation of traumatic images, of horrendous, whether it's videos or photographs of just violence, against people of color, I think I would really recommend an article by Rizvana Bradley in the Yale Review, where she talks about basically how, the proliferation of trauma is not itself productive, right? It traps you in a morgue, it traps people of color within this death that becomes so, connected and enmeshed with their ontology through these replications of these violent images. So there is almost no escape from death when there is so much repetition of it. So yes, definitely, it's always great to be critical and to keep in mind the violence of the viewing of a photo, the taking of a photo, and to think of ways of, deflection, invisibility, to resist such violence.